Good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for your participation in the second day of the seminar. I remind you, we are at this seminar, China, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Infrastructure, Connectivity, and Everyday Life. We had yesterday two very interesting sessions with 7 presentations focused on the topic of Chinese infrastructure projects in Latin America, including also some overseas foreign direct investment transactions in the region. And I remind you, this is the reflection of the and the result of the cooperation between ALC-China and the University of Pittsburgh that has been going on at least since 2016, and now with the project led by Joseph Alter, Dr. Joseph Alter and Dr. Jim Cook at the Asian Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh, and also supported and coordinated by the Center for Latin American Studies also at the university. Yesterday, I think we had a very interesting contribution by the authors from different regions and countries of the world, including the United States, China, and of course, Latin America. In the case of today, we will have today 2 presentations. Unfortunately, Dr. Sergio Martinez Rivera will not be able to participate today in the morning. And we will have 2 interesting presentations regarding the important issue of Chinese immigration and the Chinese diaspora. I remind you, in 2013, 2014, led and supported by Alejandro Portes and Ariel Armani also, there was a very interesting research project regarding the Chinese diaspora in the United States, and with a module or a section on Latin America. This was published in 2016 by the journal Migración y Desarrollo, with a group of case studies on Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. Today, what we wish is to, if possible, we saw yesterday for the case of infrastructure projects, some of the difficulties in engaging and trying to highlight the topic of everyday life. But today what we wish is to emphasize this topic of everyday life of Chinese immigrants in Latin America, very clearly the situation in general of China and of Chinese immigrants in 2013, 2014 is different than in 2021. The two analyses of our authors are really excellent in the case of Chile and in the case of Peru and Mexico. And well, we will have, I'm sure, interesting contributions to understand these topics in both cases. To start, I would like, as we did yesterday, I would like to introduce to you Professor Ariel Armani. Josh, do you want to introduce Ariel?
Yes, I'm very happy to do that. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Joseph Alter. I'm the director of the Asian Studies Center. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you for this fascinating conference. It's really a pleasure to be working so closely with Dr. Enrique Dussel Peters at UNAM to represent the extent to which our interest in global Asia is extending into close partnership in Latin America. This morning, this afternoon, this evening, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Dr. Ariel Armani, the keynote speaker for today. Ariel Armani leads the University of Pittsburgh's global engagement as the Vice Provost of Global Affairs and directs the University Center for International Studies, home to the university's top-ranked thematic and area studies centers. He also holds faculty appointments in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and the Department of Political Science in the Dietrich School of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Armani's work has been published in leading journals in the United States, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and China. He's published nearly 20 books and special issues. His book, The Dubious Link, Civil Engagement and Democratization from Stanford University Press in 2004, was a university bestseller. Dr. Armani's latest book is The Global Edge, Miami in the 21st Century, from University of California Press, co-authored with Alejandro Portes. Professor Armani is a frequent commentator for US and international media, most recently on the topics of the changing role of China and Latin America, the globalization of cities, and innovation in international education. His research areas also include democratization, civil society, and human rights topics. Before arriving at the University of Pittsburgh, Professor Armani led the University of Miami's Institute for Advanced Study of the Americas. He has been a Fulbright Scholar, Rockefeller Foundation Scholar, and Residential Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Under Armani's leadership, the University Center for International Studies received the Senator Paul Simon Award for Comprehensive Internationalization in 2017 from NAFSA. As reflected in this award and the many initiatives that have taken shape under his vision, including this conference, Professor Armani has been a champion of global engagement at all levels of higher education. We are honored to have him participate in this conference to give today's keynote address. Please join me in welcoming Vice Provost Ariel Armani.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you for the kind introduction. I want to start by thanking again, as I did yesterday, Joe Walter, Jim Cook, and Enrique Dussel Peters for your extraordinary work in conceiving and putting together this important, very, very important seminar. And I hope that the result of the seminar is another publication, the first seminar that we organized together, resulted in a volume on infrastructure that, as I mentioned yesterday, had almost 10,000 downloads from all around the world, showing the interest in these topics. Today, I want to place my presentation on the important issue of Chinese immigration to Latin America and the Caribbean in the context initially of rethinking Latin Americanism. The transnational axis is key to rethink Latin Americanism. The challenge is to rethink whatever Latin America means and will mean. One of the most flagrant omissions in understanding Latin America has been the marginalization of the Pacific in the construction of what Latin America means, and the largely absent role of the Pacific in Latin American area studies. Fortunately, following the lead of scholars such as Evelyn Hu de Hart, a growing number of scholars, particularly historians, but also anthropologists and those working in the field of cultural studies, have been working to address these omissions since the start of the 2000s. If we want to place the current relationship between China and Latin America in a historical context and make better sense of the multiple meanings of this relationship, we can resort to a simple but compelling metaphor. The highways being built today in Latin America under China's New Silk Road cannot be decoupled in our worldview from the ocean that has provided a highway for peoples from the Pacific world for centuries. It's not simply a matter of studying the Americas from a trans-Pacific perspective. Latin Americanism has not properly taken into account that we have a strong connection with the Western world through the Pacific. thinking of Latin Americanism as a space where the original identity exists in confluence, tension, and negotiation with both the Atlantic and the Pacific allows us to repair a critical historical omission. This is, I believe, absolutely essential to build a Latin Americanism that is multidimensional and truly multicultural. We must think of a global Latin America defined by two essential aspects: connectivity and inclusion. The first requires us to think of the region as a space that results from complex connections developed over time. Consequently, the topics of study acquire a greater richness if we connect them to the circulation of people, ideas, and objects, and if we consider the intersection of cultures, histories, economies. We must let issues, identities, and histories travel across borders and oceans. Inclusion is a consequence of connectivity. This perspective frees us from a Eurocentric construction of history. It is imperative to consider Latin America as a space that connects the East and the West. As Walter Mignolo wrote a number of years ago, and I quote, "It is an illusion to think that Latin America is an isolated entity and that to study it would just mean to look at what is inside." This is important as it allows us to understand how the centers of economic and geopolitical power at the global and regional level have changed their position through the centuries and how these changes impacted Latin America. Recent studies by historians have begun to draw a description of a colonial world much larger than that associated with Spain, England, and the rest of Europe. For societies in Latin America, the Hispano-Asian Pacific world provided them with greater autonomy than the Atlantic world. In the past decade or so, a large body of research by historians, sociologists, and anthropologists has begun to study the previously neglected history of Asian migration in Latin America and the Caribbean. Although their presence was duly acknowledged in official documents as well as in popular culture for centuries, Asians have been hidden in plain sight in the historiography of Latin America, as Hudehart and Lopez have argued. Hudehart claims that immigrants remained peripheral in Latin American Aryan studies until the 2000s due to the marginalization of immigration and immigrants as a focus of research. Asian Latin American populations were not racialized as Black or Indian, were not either white, but have the shared experience of being considered as undesirable immigrants. Only looking, as US-trained scholars often do, at race or diaspora will yield an incomplete picture of the real presence of Asians in Latin America. New studies on Asian immigrants to Latin America in the 19th and 20th century signify a major shift in Latin American studies. The detailed and systematic analysis of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean immigration to countries such as Mexico, Peru, and Argentina open new discussions on slavery, cultural identities, transnational communities, nationalism, racism, and local economies and infrastructure, such as sugar and cotton farms, the guano industry, the construction of railways, and so on. As a publication in the early 2000s put it, and I quote, "Asia is not a geographical and cultural distant latitude. It is a vivid presence in Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, one can find Asia in the kitchen of most Latin American countries, in education, sports, and moral values." End of quote. At the same time, Asian immigrants often resorting to trans-Pacific ties have made a claim to belonging in their new countries and have challenged traditional notions of national identity and nationhood. So there is a lot of fascinating work that has been done in recent years and a lot of work ahead. Generally, the study of immigrant communities has been characterized by an emphasis on individuals and families, focusing both on their histories and on their current condition. Recent studies with a focus on Latin America have shown interest in the network of organizations built by these communities and its importance both in facilitating the integration of immigrants and maintaining their ties with their country of origin. With these organizations, immigrant groups have become key players between their country of origin and current home, as well as for other influential organizations and institutions in both countries. So in the rest of my remarks today, I want to discuss the role of Chinese immigrant organizations in Latin America. This is an interesting perspective because it speaks about people-to-people connections, and it brings together transnational connections from above, government and diplomatic corps, and from below, organized groups as part of civil society. The government of the People's Republic of China has been very active in supporting transnational connections by founding overseas Chinese relations offices at the national, provincial, and municipal levels, and organizing a multitude of programs and activities for them. For their part, the Chinese immigrant communities have created on their own initiative a whole network of organizations, from the traditional ones based on a common surname or on the same region of origin, to more modern ones based on professional networks and alumni associations of university graduates in China. These immigrant organizations have taken on special importance in Latin America, a region with a long history of Chinese immigration, as China continues to extend its presence and to gain influence in the region. So let me talk a little bit, very briefly, about some shifts in Latin American immigration. Large contingents of Chinese workers migrated in the 19th and early 20th century to countries such as Cuba and Peru, which, for example, received almost 250,000 trafficked Chinese laborers between the years 1840 and 1900, with the main purpose of replacing the indigenous or African labor force that was becoming scarce due to the demographic implosion of the indigenous peoples and the end of slavery. Although many died before finishing indentured work contracts, many of those that did survive created close communities, in part to protect themselves from strong external discrimination or outright violence, such as the 1911 Torreon massacre in Coahuila, Mexico, in which over 300 Chinese residents were killed. Over time, however, they integrated into the whole societies, establishing companies and businesses. In parallel with the United States, Chinese immigrants and their descendants created areas of commercial concentration, generally known as Chinatowns, in the main cities of the countries where they settled. For example, the Barrio Chino in Lima, Peru, one of the most famous Chinatowns in Latin America, is located in the historic center of the city and boasts over 6,000 restaurants, some of which are over 100 years old. Chinese immigration has continued throughout the decades and has been re-energized in recent decades, accompanying the growing economic and political presence of the People's Republic of China in the Western Hemisphere. Temporary, low-skilled Chinese workers began arriving for work-specific projects to many countries in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Grenada. The lifting of visa requirements in Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela has resulted in an increase in Chinese immigrants, with executives and high-skilled workers concentrated in the Southern Cone and Mexico. This growing presence is due to several factors. First, Chinese multinational companies have imported their own staff, from executive to skilled workers, when setting up operations. These companies have a growing presence in extractive industries such as mining and oil, and in large infrastructure projects, as we saw yesterday. Tech giants from China have also developed projects for the communication infrastructure and service provision in the region. Most of this immigration is temporary, but some choose to stay in the host country. The growing interest China has taken in Latin America has exploded the demand for the study of Portuguese and Spanish languages in China, with a new generation of Chinese students mastering these languages. In just under 20 years, the number of Chinese undergraduates studying Spanish rose from a few hundred in 1999 to about 20,000 in 2016. Thousands of these students then go to Latin America to study the Spanish language, literature, history, and other subjects in large Latin American universities, as well as invest there, open businesses, and work in diplomatic capacities in the region. Another cause of the new Chinese migration to some countries in Latin America is the growing economic development of the People's Republic of China and the greater opportunities to travel abroad. This has allowed a growing number of people to accumulate savings and obtain credits for later investment in other countries. With these funds, new immigrants from provinces such as Fujian and Zhejiang have bought businesses and created restaurants and supermarkets by the dozens in cities such as Buenos Aires and Mexico City. This new migratory trend has unique characteristics. In the past, international migrations generally went from the most resource-poor countries to industrialized countries, or those regions experiencing the fastest economic growth. In the present case, China, with one of the fastest growth rates in the world, continues to export its population, including to countries in Africa and Latin America. In this way, the growing Chinese presence in these continents manifests itself in two ways. On the one hand, through embassies and large corporations, and on the other hand, through a continuous flow of small businesses, students, and workers. So, what about immigrant organizations? So, to better understand the political implications of Latin America's relationship with China, it is necessary to explore the most dynamic elements of their interaction through the network of organizations of the diaspora and migration. South-South migration is important in human and labor capital flows and serves as a bridge between countries in many dimensions, including business and trade connections. This approach from an everyday life viewpoint allows us to study the development of networks that go beyond states, and at the same time frees us from an analysis that seeks to identify winners and losers to open our perspective to other aspects of globalization. Individual and collective actors play an important transnational role, acting simultaneously in their country and abroad. So beginning with China's opening to the world and the economic reforms in the last decades of the 20th century, the leadership of the People's Republic of China adopted a policy of promoting relations with the Chinese diaspora, encouraging Chinese migrants to join Chinese organizations and Chinese immigrant associations in their host countries. The Chinese government went on to propose to its citizens abroad to serve their country from abroad, 为国 为我服务, instead of asking them to return to serve the country. Hui for you. In the 1980s and 1990s, overseas Chinese associations took on relevance as Chinese authorities sought to attract both Chinese-owned capital to advance economic development goals and Chinese entrepreneurs to participate in joint ventures. As overseas Chinese were considered strategic allies for the development of the country, the Chinese government institutionalized relationships with immigrant entrepreneurs and other Chinese immigrants through the creation of specialized expatriate offices, Qiaoban, at the national, provincial, and local levels. So in the case of Latin America, the activities of embassies with respect to established immigrant communities sought to facilitate relations with the respective governments and societies. In some cases, there are many years residing in the host country, often spanning several generations, endow Chinese communities with a broad knowledge of the language and customs of each country. This information was of great value to diplomatic personnel. In the same way, the capacity of local Chinese organizations to organize, for example, receptions and welcoming acts for visiting dignitaries and to facilitate access to local networks, very important, turn out to be a valuable resource that diplomatic representations in the same country lacked. As in the United States, preserving the good image of the People's Republic of China turns out to be a high priority for embassies, especially as it pertains to the PRC's territorial claim to the island of Taiwan, and more recently, as it pertains to the global pandemic, seeking to shape the narrative concerning China's role in the origins of the pandemic. One of the key purposes of the PRC embassies is to neutralize any potential opposition activities presented by the Chinese immigrant communities that endanger the good image that Chinese diplomats and dignitaries try to project. To combat this danger, Chinese personnel obviously cannot resort to coercion, as might be the case if opponents lived in China. Instead, it resorts to various types of rewards, judicially administered to compensate collaborators of official initiatives and exclude the opponents. These embassy activities, plus China's growing political and economic presence in Latin America, have had a notable double effect. First, they have strengthened the transnational ties of Chinese ethnic organizations previously limited to purely domestic projects and activities within each country. Contrary to what happened in the United States, immigrant transnationalism is to a large extent in Latin America the result of initiatives from above, that is, by the Chinese government rather than by the internal dynamics of the immigrant communities themselves. A second consequence is the resurgence or reaffirmation of ethnic identity in a significant number of members of these communities. In particular, descendants of Chinese immigrants already assimilated to the language and customs of the host societies have experienced to an increasing degree a process of re-sinification, seeking to learn a language already forgotten and to identify as Chinese, with or without a national script. So we start seeing the notion of Chinese Peruvians, for example, Mexican Chinese more and more. The increasing power and prestige of the People's Republic of China clearly influences this resurgence of ethnic pride, but it's also associated with the remarkable advantages, material and social, that ties with what embassy staff and Chinese company executives can bring. I'd like to devote a few minutes to provide some observations on Chinese immigrant communities in 4 Latin American countries: Peru, Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina. These are interesting cases that illuminate a number of aspects of everyday life in different settings in the region. As Enrique said, these case studies originate in a project on Chinese transnationalism in Latin America that I conceived and led with Alejandro Portes, which involved a great team of researchers in various Latin American countries. And also, as Enrique mentioned, the studies were published as a special issue of Migración y Desarrollo in 2016. In fact, Sergio Martinez Rivera, who won't be with us today, wrote one of the articles with Enrique. So let me talk very briefly let me start with Peru. In their study on Chinese associations in Peru, Carla Tamaño and Norma Velázquez distinguished 3 groups of associations: those created by first-generation immigrants and that cover a range of activities including mutual assistance, sports, religion, and business; Tucson associations, those born in Peru, that are dedicated to social cultural integration and dissemination activities; and the Peruvian Chinese associations, whose purpose is to facilitate relations between Peru and the People's Republic of China, promoting cultural, social, and economic activities. In their study, Tamaño and Velázquez identify a great variety of links between ethnic and business associations in Peru and the Chinese embassy, as well as a remarkable network of relationships with various Chinese ministries and provincial chambers of commerce in China. In the context of the expansion of Chinese companies abroad, the transnational relations of Chinese associations in Peru have developed remarkably, and they weave networks that facilitate trade and investment. In this process, government organizations such as the Chinese Council for the Promotion of International Trade and the Association for the Development of China Abroad maintain fluid relations with Peruvian associations, creating a fertile base for the expansion of business ties and support to investments in Peru. These and other relations are considered strategic for both countries. Chinese immigrant organizations in Peru are seen by Beijing as a key bridge for cooperation. In this sense, the Chinese government is keen in recognizing the role they play in the bilateral relationship and is interested in reinforcing a sense of loyalty and patriotism towards China among Chinese associations. The transnational relations of Chinese individuals and organizations in Peru played an integral part establishing diplomatic relations with China after its reopening in 1971, with Peru being one of the first nations to do so. Since 2010, when China and Peru signed a free trade agreement, China has become both Peru's top trading partner and one of the largest investors in the country. We observed a simultaneous process of globalization and localization, in the sense that revitalization of the networks of Chinese organizations and the links they develop with each other and with China has promoted transnational mobility, and at the same time, it has helped to underscore a common Chinese identity, as well as a sense of belonging to the destination society. These aspects relate to Patricia Palma's study, which examines how Peruvian identity has adopted tradition and habits introduced by Chinese immigrants and processes of acculturation within the Chinese community in Peru, through the context of gastronomy and the Chinese restaurant business. Given the long-standing, often racist and exclusionary experience of Chinese immigrants in Peru, Palma explores how food has impacted both the Chinese immigrant community in Peru and overall Peruvian identity and the intricate linkages between the two. I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip my brief analysis of the case of Mexico, because maybe during the Q&A and given the fact that we have Enrique Dussel Peters who wrote that article, we can talk more about that. And I'm going to shift briefly to Colombia and Argentina. So in Colombia, similar to Mexico, Colombia has experienced a change in the profile of Chinese migrants arriving in the country, moving from a group of migrants with a low educational and socioeconomic level, the majority of who are small merchants, to a type of migrant linked to transnational Chinese companies, officials and senior executives, and characterized by a higher educational level and greater professional training. So despite these differences, as a study by Diana Andrea Lopez and Luz Diaz on Chinese associations in Colombia reveals, the relationship between the traditional Chinese community and the new immigrants is close and based on trust and a sense of community. Their study also identified associations in the Chinese immigrant community, organizations created by the government of the People's Republic of China, organizations of Chinese and Colombians in the cultural and academic field, entities created by Colombians and focus on fostering friendship with China, and binational chambers of commerce that promote trade and investment ties between both countries. This associative universe is to a large extent the result of a limited migratory flow in comparison to other Latin American countries as a consequence of an exclusionary and racist immigration policy until well into the 20th century, a foreign policy that didn't help attract an immigrant population due to its fragmentary and contradictory nature, and an extensive period of, as we know, armed conflicts, more than 70 years, that obviously conspire against the creation of the security conditions necessary for the establishment of an immigrant community in Colombia. However, with the end of the armed conflict, Chinese labor migration grew considerably from about 10,000 Chinese migrants in 2008 to approximately more than 25,000, 30,000 in 2014. The rise in Chinese migrants to Colombia is linked to increasing bilateral trade in recent years, making China Colombia's second largest trading partner and China's fifth largest trading partner in Latin America. In Colombia, transnationalism is particularly present in the business sector and is expressed in various ways, including links with government offices in different Chinese cities focused on trade and investment promotion. The largest presence of skilled Chinese immigrants is in the hydrocarbons and telecommunications sector. The latest generation organizations tend to promote an agenda that seeks to integrate the political, economic, commercial, and cultural realities. These organizations show a high degree of cooperation and emphasize interaction with the local community with the aim of deepening the Colombia-China bilateral relationship. I'm going to move now to the conclusion rather than talking about Argentina. Maybe I can talk a little bit later. The case of Argentina is really interesting, particularly in terms of the nuanced interaction between the organizations that are connected to mainland China and the organizations, the Chinese organizations, more historical ones connected to Taiwan. And maybe we can talk about that later. So, as mentioned, preserving and enhancing the good image of the People's Republic of China is high priority for embassies. The deepening of economic ties and increased migration flows with Latin America has effects at the societal level. While Latin American governments have prioritized China's expansion of trade and investment opportunities in their countries, many Latin Americans themselves have not shown much enthusiasm for these policies. The increase in Chinese immigration, the saturation of markets with Chinese products, and competition in the manufacturing sector have created uncertainty and, in some cases, suspicion regarding the relationship with China. Overall, Latin Americans have mixed views of China. According to a Pew Research Center survey in 2019, about half of Brazilians, Mexicans, and Argentines had a favorable opinion of China. About a quarter of respondents in these three countries expressed negative views of China. As we mentioned in our study with Nicolás Velázquez, published in 2015 and focused on Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, and Peru, 72% of negative commentary on China in social media center on two things, namely China's growing economic power and the impending menace of economic domination, or apprehension about Chinese immigration. In Argentina, Chile, and Mexico, over half of respondents to a 2013 Pew Research Center poll expressed concern that, I quote, Chinese ideas and customs are spreading in their countries. In Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina, between 37 and 51% of respondents expressed dislike for China's way of doing business. Criticisms of companies of Chinese origin, for example, focus on accusations of violations of labor regulations, destruction of the environment, and lack of respect for local communities and their cultures. So clearly the view of Latin Americans towards China is complex and in certain aspects contradictory. Despite the fact that a majority recognize the importance of China and its presence in the regions, there are fears of a possible domination of China in domestic markets and for the effects that China as a global power may have on Latin America. Countries like Mexico have a history of anti-Chinese sentiments reflected in aggressions against the immigrant community. Although these attacks have diminished and discriminatory policies undone, there is still hostility and protests, sometimes violent, against communities of Chinese origin. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, as Carol Chan will discuss in her presentation, ethnic Chinese have begun to experience renewed racism and xenophobia connected to the pandemic. As we will hear later, Carol Chan's timely study examines the precarity of the Chinese migrant community in Chile in the face of racist reactions to the outbreak of COVID-19 in that country. Chinese migrants are a very small proportion of migrants in the country, but represent the third fastest growing group of immigrants in Chile. Pre-pandemic, and due to the dichotomization of migrant groups as good and bad in Chilean politics and culture, Chinese migrants, seen as good, hardworking, apolitical, were often used to stigmatize bad migrant groups. However, as COVID-19 spread throughout Latin America, verbal and physical attacks against ethnic Chinese and Chinese immigrants in Chile increased. So we will hear more about that from Carol. Let me conclude. As China continues to reaffirm its importance in the world, the re-signification of second and third generations in countries such as Peru and Mexico is a new phenomenon in the field of immigrant transnationality, which is seen around the world. The social dynamics arising from the growing presence of China in Latin America has not only re-energized the ties of immigrant communities with their peoples and regions of origin, but has also awakened ethnic identities, linguistic uses, and cultural traditions previously relegated or forgotten with the passage of time and generation. Studies on Chinese immigrant organizations in Peru, Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina represent a look at a set of actors that had not been included until recently in the analysis of the new relationship between China and Latin America. These associations allow us to understand the dynamics of China's tie with the region from a globalization from below, which opens a window to a complex set of interactions that, as I said earlier, go beyond states, corporations, or individuals themselves. At the same time, these studies show a different transnationalism that reflects a process of identity reaffirmation. So, we know that COVID-19 continues to put enormous stress on Latin American and Caribbean economies, and that the population of the region continues to perceive lower benefits than expected from their government's commercial relationship with China, coupled with an increase in anti-Chinese sentiment due to the pandemic. Therefore, it's likely that Beijing will give emphasis to engagement and outreach, not only with multilateral and regional institutions, but as well through globalization from below. As Latin America and the Caribbean look to rebuild economies wrecked by the pandemic, multilateral engagement and the intricate dynamics of Chinese ties with the region from immigrant organizations will continue to matter for Chinese foreign policy in Latin America. A week ago, I was reading a new article written by a well-known US commentator on China-Latin American relations. And I came across the following sentence, start of quote, "Among China's greatest enduring advantages in Latin America is its lack of history in the region," end of quote. It is difficult to believe that in 2021, we have to read this kind of statement published in a respectable magazine. It is myopic to restrict our analysis to government relations. Immigrants and their organizations play a major role in transnational relations. Trade, investment, and diplomacy are important, but neglecting the role of average people moving across borders and their organizations is a significant mistake. So I'm glad that this seminar avoids such a misguided approach. The presentations in today's session expand the focus on immigrants and the transnational links that speak about ethnic and immigrant Chinese experiences in Latin America, indicating that these powerful immigrant experiences offer an extremely rich perspective for understanding the dynamics of the relationship between China, Chinese immigrants, and Latin America. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vice Provost Armani. What I will do is turn the microphone over to Professor Enrique Dussel Peters to briefly provide a few comments, and the questions in the chat feature cover a large territory, but overlap, I think, with many points. So over to you, Enrique.
Yes, thank you very much, Ariel. No comments from my part. I think we have sufficient questions, so I think it's better to engage with the audience. I think, Ariel, you have access to the questions, but just to give you some time and maybe to have one, maybe two rounds of responses. Francisco Valderrey asks regarding other immigrant organizations in Latin America beyond Peru. I think you have already answered them somehow. Joe asks regarding the issue of Asian and or national identities and heritage in the case of Japanese, Korean, and Chinese also immigration. Manuel Roman Lacayo asks an important questions regarding, if I understand correctly, the integration of recent immigration to post-World War II institutions. No, this is an important question. Also, I mean, I'm going ahead, if you want to, of the presentations that we will hear in a moment. No, regarding also even the analysis of recent immigration. No, what we are finding out regarding immigration in the 21st century is that these immigrations are very different than historical immigrations, also from an institutional perspective, also in the relationship to the respective Chinese embassies. No? Marla Ripoli asks regarding the local sentiments towards Chinese immigrants. Are they perceived as businessmen, as immigrants and firms that provide labor, or are they more perceived as competitors, no? As it might happen in other parts of the North? No? And two more additional questions, one by Joe Alter regarding bottom-up immigration community institutions and what is their potential in the relationship with China today. And our dear Bettina Granso, that you might remember from Berlin some time ago, no? Hi, Bettina. Regarding Chinese immigration, are they mainly concentrated in big cities, or how do you perceive this topic? These are a first group of questions, if you want to, for a first round, no?
Well, I listed six questions, and I even went really much longer than what I expected and I'm sorry for that in my presentation. I hope it wasn't too boring. I think that I'll touch very briefly on most of these. What I would say is that what's interesting, very, very interesting about these questions is that they reaffirm the notion that I know, Enrique, you share with me, that this is an extraordinary field of study that there is so much to be done here. It is so rich, so interesting, and really a possibility to break new ground in terms of understanding, this topic. As you said, yes, there are other immigrant organizations. We find them in most of the countries in the region, and I talked a bit about other countries. What I want to say in reference to the integration of various waves of immigrants and the process of insertion in communities, as well as their geographical distribution. What we are seeing is the following, and going back to a couple of things that I said. Number one is that we need to look at immigration of Chinese origin in terms of waves that have been changing in very, very important ways, and where the recent waves in the 21st century represent a type of, in general, a type of immigrant that is very different from previous ways. Therefore, their modes of integration in their host societies is very different and will be very different. And the types of organizations that they join and that they develop are very, very different. And so this is really important, because it is changing, and it's going to change the landscape of immigration from Chinese origin in Latin America. For the most part, the concentration has been in big cities, and I think that we need more data to see whether this is changing and it's following the pattern that we see in Africa, for example, where we have seen much more distribution, in many cases related to projects of infrastructure, where workers who work in these projects then choose to stay. And this is in general a type of workforce that it's more low skilled. I also want to touch very briefly about local sentiments and this question about competition, and mention something that maybe the audience will find interesting. As I said, in 2015, I published an article on anti-Chinese attitudes in Latin America, focusing on a set of Latin American countries. Right now, I'm working with Nicolás Velázquez on a very large project where what we are doing is looking at views of China in Latin America and Africa as seen from Facebook comments on news about China and the Chinese. So we are focused on a set of countries in Africa: Kenya, Namibia, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zambia, and a set of countries in Latin America: Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela. So we are working with thousands of comments, which are our units of analysis, and the preliminary results are very, very interesting in terms of illuminating, especially in particular, issues such as those raised in that question. So what I would say is that there are a variety of very, very interesting sentiments that are rapidly changing in terms of the perceptions of China as a country and Chinese communities, and of course, to a very, very important extent, shaped by the global pandemic.
Great, thank you very much, Ariel. Look, there are three additional questions maybe for a second round, and so that we finish more or less on time. One from Bettina Granso again, or what is the response of LAC governments in terms of migration policies and governance to rising numbers of immigrants? And practically a similar question, but from the other side, how does the People's Republic of China government pay attention to the issue of the overseas Chinese in Latin America? No? And finally, a question from Lourdes Marquina that will probably fall a bit short since Sergio is not participating, but asking about, in general, Chinese immigration in Mexico and the talent immigration in Mexico. That question maybe we can send to Sergio. And with this, maybe we can close this first part of your keynote speech. No?
So I know we need to finish by 10, so I'll just take a minute or less and refer to the first two questions, as you say, and we can deal with the question of talent later. These two questions taken together are extremely interesting because the response from governments in Latin America varies, and what we see in a number of countries, Argentina is a good example, is a very welcoming position on the part of governments, seeing that increasing immigration from China is perceived as adding to the country, as the possibility to bring more investment, to bring more business, to extend connections. So it's very, very interesting how we are seeing more and more a big shift regarding what was, of course, older approaches to this type of immigration. At the same time, what we see on the part of China is that the Chinese government, through its particularly its diplomatic networks, has shifted in light of the pandemic to an approach in which, rather than focusing on opposing what are perceived as negative views of China, the emphasis is on highlighting positive aspects of China. And in that sense, we all know about the new health diplomacy that China has very, very actively promoted. And in Latin America, this has been very, very important. So the role of Chinese communities and Chinese organizations becomes more and more important with this new approach in terms of promoting the role of China as a partner, as an ally, as a country very interested in dealing with the consequences of the pandemic and working with countries in the region to rebuild the economies in Latin America.
Thank you very much, Ariel, for your very interesting introduction of the day and two next presentations that we will have. I would simply comment from a 2021 perspective, and maybe for some of the researchers, interestingly, I do not expect a response from you, but listening to you, interestingly, for example, in the China CELAC Forum, for example, while we have hundreds of topics, no, from sports to trade to whatever, no, the topic from a regional perspective of immigration does practically not appear, no? Yes, we have the abstract topic of people-to-people relationship, but the topic, surprisingly, because as we will hear in a moment, and as you argued, it is a very dynamic topic, but from a regional perspective, surprisingly, this topic does not appear, no? I don't know if it is the source of this lack is in China or in Latin America, but it's a surprising lack, no?
Let me just, I don't want to get into a debate, but let me mention, I agree with you, but at the same time, what we shouldn't neglect is to mention that in the China CELAC Forum in 2018, it was China outlined a joint action plan for 2019-2021 with priority areas that included an increased exchange in the health sector, especially in the control and prevention of diseases and response to health emergencies. So this was, put on the table by China prior to the pandemic through CELAC. So that's very, very interesting in terms of, this dynamic.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Armani, for a very stimulating keynote address that raised a number of issues that relate very well to yesterday's stimulating discussion and clearly lay the foundation for the upcoming presentations. And thank you, Enrique, for drawing together the questions to really highlight these key issues. With that, I will turn it over to Enrique Dussel Peters, who will be moderating session 3, and Dr. Freddy Gonzalez, who will be the discussant for the session this morning. So over to you, Enrique, and thank you again very much, Vice Provost Armani. A virtual applause for a wonderful talk this morning. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ariel. And I think it's a beautiful introduction and framework for the interesting discussion and session that we will have and begin now. No? So we will have two presentations, and we are looking forward to hear the discussion points of Freddy Gonzalez. So we will start with presentations. I think we have around 25 minutes by Carol Chan first. I remind you, Carol Chan is assistant professor in the School of Sociology of Universidad, Academia de Humanismo Cristiano in Chile. She has been working for quite some time on these topics and issues of China and Chile, and particularly Chinese immigration. And she's working on a book manuscript co-authored with Maria Elvira Rios and Maria Mont Strabucci on the topic Representations of Chinese and Chineseness in Chile, no? Which will be probably published very soon in Macmillan. No? Thank you very much, Carol.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me just try to share my screen right now. All right. Do you see it? Does it work fine?
Yes.
Very well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this really wonderful seminar. And also, I really appreciated Dr. Armoni's introduction, which really gave a wonderful overview, which is very difficult to do, on immigration, Chinese immigration in Latin America. So without further ado, I'm going to start. So I would like to give some context before talking about migration in Chile, right? To understand how Chinese migration is in Chile. So Chile's migrant population increased more than sixfold in the past 2 decades, currently representing about 7.8% of the population. Most of these migrants are from neighboring countries or elsewhere in Latin America and the Caribbean. While Chinese migrants represent less than 1% of the migrant population, which is really small, it has consistently been the third fastest growing population in relative terms. So this phenomenon of rapidly increasing migration has sparked intense public discussions in Chile and led to the implementation of several new executive decrees in recent years. As part of the government's broader migration management strategy, these changes led to increasingly exclusionary outcomes and were justified in terms of concerns about the threats that migrants presented to the country's social order. Politicians and citizens, including the then candidate and current President Sebastián Piñera, expressed a dichotomy between good migrants who contribute to the country's economic development and bad migrants who are criminals, thieves and drug traffickers that they want to exclude from the country. So in these pre-pandemic discussions, Chinese migrants were generally represented as the epitome of the model minority, migrants who are good and desirable. The image as hardworking entrepreneurs and passive apolitical people was strategically used to contrast with and stigmatize other racialized, typically Black or indigenous migrant groups as criminals or undeserving dependents on the state. However, the 2020 global outbreak of COVID-19 revealed that such apparent social acceptance of the Chinese in Chile was and has arguably always been conditional and fragile. From as early as February last year, some ethnic Chinese in Chile reported verbal and physical attacks against them in public spaces. Chilean public television screened racist and xenophobic comedy sketches blaming Chinese people for the pandemic, and like-minded memes circulated in Chilean social media platforms, as you can see here on the right. These reproduced old stereotypes about the Chinese as barbaric, dirty, backward, and diseased. Xenophobic flyers on the left were distributed near Chinese businesses in the town of Villa Alemana with the image of a bat and the words, "Chinese get out of Villa Alemana, due to your fault, thousands are dying. Go back to your country." So it's quite violent, and you can see the exclamation marks and the capital letters here, right? So during this period, Chinese businesses and products were presented by public figures on television as being dangerous due to the fear of contagion. In the context of this shifting, unstable, and conflicting perceptions and attitudes towards the Chinese, on the one hand as good migrants, model minority, and on the other hand, old tropes of the yellow peril, Today, I would like to examine the diverse experiences and impact of China and Chile from the point of view of ethnic Chinese migrants and residents, Chileans, and to a lesser extent, Latin American migrants in the capital of Santiago. So I use China and Chile very broadly to refer to perceptions of and responses to elements of China and Chineseness in the country. So more the imaginary ideas associated about China as a threat or China as opportunity. So these range from forms of Chinese investment, infrastructural products, Chinese immigration, Chinese businesses and products. I won't talk about all of them, but in general, this idea of China, right? And how it manifests itself in everyday life for migrants and non-migrants in Chile, in Santiago. So my talk is based on ethnographic and archival research conducted among and about the diverse ethnic Chinese community in Santiago between 2017 and 2020. And it's organized as follows. I will first contextualize very briefly Chinese presence and migration to Chile before discussing Chilean and Chinese responses to a plan by the Santiago mayor and a local government in China to invest and establish a Chinatown in the Chilean capital. So a brief background that Dr. Armani already provided for us. The Chinese broadly arrived to Latin America from 1840s as coolies or contract labor that replaced the demand for labor in agriculture and mining after the abolition of slavery. And then in the following decades, more arrived to the west coasts of US, Costa Rica, Panama to build infrastructure, such as railroads and the Panama Canal. And then there is more contemporary migration, which I will talk about later. But in the context of Chile, the first documented presence of the Chinese in what is contemporary Chile dates from the 1850s, during which one of the first coolies designated for work in the Guaneras arrived in the port of Iquique in the north. Many other Chinese arguably arrived or escaped from Peru and Cuba to Chile during this time and the later decades. The growing nitrate industry in northern Chile is important, particularly in the province of Tarapacá, which attracted many Chinese to work and settle there as free men, especially after the War of the Pacific between Chile and Peru on the border. So many Chinese coolies participated in this war on the side of Chile. And after the war, these men were granted their freedom and granted Chilean citizenship. Many of them engaged in manual labor and provided services related to the nitrate industry. So during this time in the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a lot of discrimination and exclusion of Chinese as migrants. Chilean authorities officially defined migration as legitimate only for the free people of European or US origin. So the Chinese were considered coolies, semi-slaves. And throughout the early 20th century, only the Chinese and no other nationalities had to undergo medical examinations to certify they were healthy, free of disease, and vaccinated. So that gives you a sense of the prejudice and stigma against mainly Chinese nationals. But despite this overt racism, discrimination, and forms of exclusion, the census evidenced a general trend of upward social economic mobility for the Chinese from the 1910s and 20s onward, where many more Chinese could be found as petty traders and small business owners, as opposed to their prior concentration as day laborers and employees for other people. So historians have argued that the Chinese established intra-ethnic networks as a strategy to confront discrimination and foster a more positive image as a community, and Dr. Armani also talked about this. For example, in Chile, they loaned one another small capital to start small businesses, and these businesses, such as bread shops, grocery stores, were spaces and instances that mediated everyday communication and interaction with locals. So over time, locals' familiarity with these shops and their owners and workers gained the Chinese a reputation in the north of Chile, particularly, as trustworthy and hardworking people, a view which partially counteracted other pre-existing views of the Chinese as untrustworthy and suspicious. So, back to today, right? A new wave of contemporary Chinese migration globally and to Chile began in the 1980s with the economic liberalization of China under Deng Xiaoping, which meant looser travel restrictions and state encouragement of Chinese investment overseas under the going out policy. The majority of the Chinese who arrived in Chile were traders and business owners during this time, with many Cantonese migrants establishing Chinese restaurants and grocery shops around Santiago City, particularly in the neighborhood called Mix, which I will talk about later. So these are some images of the more traditional 1980s Cantonese restaurants. A further diversification and expansion of the Chinese population in Chile occurred with the signing of the free trade agreement between PRC and Chile in 2005. These more recent migrants came not only from southern Chinese provinces such as Guangdong, but also from places such as Zhejiang, Fujian, Jiangsu, Henan, Beijing, and Sichuan, amongst others, so very diverse. While many opened small shops and businesses selling diverse products, including shoes, electronics, household items, clothes, others arrived as professionals, teachers, and engineers linked to the establishment of Confucius Institutes in Chile, as well as large telecommunications companies such as Huawei and Chinese mining companies. Data from Chinese associations estimate around 20,000 Chinese migrants in the country, and the upward estimate is 50,000. Notably, China has surpassed the US as Chile's top trading partner since 2013. So that is also a big factor in increased Chinese immigration today. So as you can see here, one of the Chinese malls is called the Zhejiang Mall. The Zhejiangese have stood out particularly in 21st century Chinese arrivals to Chile in leading the rapid establishment of shops and several Chinese malls in the capital of Santiago, particularly in the neighborhood colloquially known as Mix. Mix is located near the central train station or Estación Central. In the past 5 years, these Zhejiang Chinese-owned shops have expanded outside of Santiago as well and can be found in towns large and small throughout the country, to speak to a question in the previous discussion. So I'll talk about the project to establish a Chinatown in Santiago now. There's never been a historic Chinatown in Santiago, unlike Buenos Aires and Lima, where popular and thriving Chinatowns were established historically by ethnic Chinese populations. This is likely due to the comparatively lower numbers of Chinese migrants in Chile, as well as the fact that many arrived and were concentrated in the north of Chile rather than the capital. Nevertheless, the past decade has seen the organic concentration of Chinese-owned shops, businesses, and residents in a multicultural commercial neighborhood known as Mix. And you can see there's even a church, a Chinese church. So why is it called Mix? This nickname is due to a busy street that owes its name to the US citizen Henry Mix, who helped to build the railroad that connected Santiago to the Valparaiso port city. Indeed, Mix is also located near the central train station, as you can see here, that connects the city to others south of the capital. And because of this, the neighborhood has historically been a residential and commercial space characterized by trade and exchange between diverse persons in terms of social class and background. Indigenous persons from the south, for example, arrived in the city via Mix in search of work or to purchase products in the city to then sell in their places of origin. An iconic stationery shop that still exists today called D-Mix was established in 1937 by a Syrian migrant, attesting to the diverse population linked to both internal and international migration that built this neighborhood. Mix continues to be a thriving commercial neighborhood today, perpetually full of pedestrian traffic throughout the year. Due to this characteristic constant flow of goods and people, the area around the central station has also gained a reputation for being unsafe or insecure, where shops and individuals are susceptible to theft, robbery, and assault. News reports often include sensationalist headlines of armed violence that tend to involve ethnic Chinese shopkeepers as victims of crime. So with the increased visibility of Chinese persons and businesses in the neighborhood in the past decade, the neighborhood has earned the nickname Chinatown or Barrio Chino in the press and among local residents and regular clients. So in May of 2018, the Santiago mayor announced plans to establish the neighborhood as a Chinatown. So as you can see from this quote, the idea of a Chinatown is to place signage in Spanish and Chinese, giving a so-called Oriental styles, and to have arches that will serve to mark the entrance and exit of Chinatown, very similar to other Chinatowns, famous Chinatowns in the world. And it would cost a lot of money and will be primarily or almost completely funded by Chinese merchants who work in the area and the government of Li Shui, which is a local government in China, linked to the Chinese that are present, new Chinese migrants present in Barrio Mix today. So proposing Chinatown is part of an urban renewal project that involves cooperation between new Chinese entrepreneur migrants and Western governments, constitute an emerging global trend that Santiago is now firmly participating in, one that seeks to capitalize on the rise of China economy, what many have called Chinatown 2.0, where new Chinatowns in the 21st century are now increasingly associated with the modern Chinese nation state, rather than the local ethnic Chinese community with a long history of survival and settlement in the host country. Nevertheless, these modern Chinatown projects tend to draw on local Chinese communities to stake, and I quote here, a claim on contemporary China and its material and symbolic power within the global imaginary, where Monica DeHart observed in the case of Costa Rica, the Chinese community was not necessarily positioned as an agent of this urban transformation. So the same dynamic was true for local Chinese residents and merchants in MIGS. After the Chinatown project was announced, I spoke to several contacts in the region, in the area, about their responses. And the vast majority told me they didn't hear about it before the official announcement, and they had not been consulted regarding their views or ideas about the project. So very similar to what DeHart found in Costa Rica. So Guangdong persons, one Guangdong resident who had been living in Chile for a long time, wrote an op-ed in Mandarin Chinese about this announcement. And he said, I hope that through the Chinatown project, we can change the security situation of the Huashang wholesale area and the environment, and strengthen security management and enhance the overall image of the Chinese in the local area. So I find that this comment was very telling. It reflects the general response of Chinese merchants in MIGS. Many that I spoke to that year expressed the hope or desire that Chinatown would bring better infrastructure for the neighborhood, as well as more police presence to ensure better security. In expressing concerns about security in the neighborhood, concerns shared by Chinese and non-Chinese residents, their responses shift the discussion's focus away from sensationalist Chinatown headlines and associated discourses about the rising influence of Chinese state and businesses in Chile and Latin America. However, some Zhejiang migrants specifically acknowledged that it would be nice to showcase China in Chile via the establishment of a modern Chinatown. So they were more concerned about the image of China and that Chileans would know more about China and modern China. So this contrasted with older generations of Chinese residents that tended to emphasize the hope that the Chinatown project can clean up the neighborhood, which would then affect the reputation of the Chinese in Chile. So these discourses are distinct, where the attachment and identification as Chilean citizens in the latter community is evident, in contrast with newer migrants' identification with the PRC nation and its image. Despite these differences, both groups also expressed hesitance and ambivalence about the hypervisibility that a Chinatown would bring to the Chinese community in terms of security as well as potential competitors. As you can see here, they said even more robbers might be attracted to the place, or more Chinese would move in and compete in an already saturated market. So these responses by Chinese residents and merchants in MIGS show how increased Chinese presence in the city and increased Chinese investments, such as the Chinatown project, impact their everyday life too, because they, as Chinese migrants, are also part of the residential community, right, and population in Chile. So these discussions about China's impact them as well. So Chilean media coverage of the Chinatown proposal was mixed. A notable criticism came from a councilman who framed MIGS as a historically diverse sector where other migrant and ethnic communities live and work alongside the Chinese. So, and some locals also said things like, there are Chileans who work here, this is not part of China. If they want to decorate, they should put Chilean things. We should encourage Chilean merchants. So it's quite nationalistic, this discourse. So what we see here is a debate over the nature and aesthetics of the city. In contrast, other local Chilean traders also expressed positive sentiments in commenting that the Chinatown might bring more tourists to the area and also increase police presence, businesses, and development. In fact, many Chileans expressed the importance for the municipality to prioritize security, just like the Chinese peers. And they also desired for better infrastructure, such as parking lots, public street lighting. In general, those who rejected the idea of the project responded to Chinatown as threatening a sense of Chilean national identity, linked to MIGS as a local space, whereas those who embraced it highlighted the benefits of taking advantage of the new global China brand and capital, such as attracting tourists, right, to the area. These diverse responses evidence different ways that the rise of China as trope and its potential and lived material reality in the world and Chile impact how residents negotiate this idea and relationships, identities within Chile. But these discourses of them Chinese and us Chileans in the press in these coverage of Chinatown exist along alongside vibrant and creative practices of interethnic collaboration and conviviality in MIGs, defined as the capacity to live together. Attending to and visibilizing these everyday experiences of multiculturalism or cultural diversity is important to understanding how lived realities compare against often dominant perceptions and extreme perceptions, right, in discourses of either romanticized social integration or xenophobia. Through long-term ethnographic fieldwork with a colleague, the sociologist Carolina Ramirez, we conducted conversations and interviews with Chinese and non-Chinese merchants, workers, and clients. We came to understand MIGs as a diverse multicultural space that is also undeniably shaped by the dominant presence of Chinese shopkeepers, businesses, clients, and residents. In other words, MIGs is simultaneously an informal Chinatown, and it is also a multicultural space. We found that everyday life for residents we spoke to was characterized not by segregation, but by interethnic conviviality and collaboration. Chinese shopkeepers established relations of interdependence with their non-Chinese workers and neighbors. Chilean and Latin American workers would function as linguistic and cultural translators for their Chinese employers and colleagues, not just in relation to potential regular clients of the shops, but also when Chinese businesses were attacked, as they were often that often happened by robbers or thieves, and the Chinese couldn't communicate their situation to the police officers. In this context of daily insecurity, we found that residents and clients in MIGs work to foster relations of mutual trust over time, to make the neighborhood a more habitable space, but also to protect persons and businesses from harm and danger. So it's very practical, this sense that they need to care for each other. Mundane acts of care and reciprocity help to foster such an environment in relations of trust over time. Neighboring shopkeepers, Chinese and non-Chinese, help to watch one another's shops and stalls for them if they were to step out for a quick errand or to go to the bathroom. It was not uncommon for Chinese employers to invite their non-Chinese employees to a big meal, either monthly or annually, and workers told us they appreciated this display of appreciation for the work and contribution to the success of the business. It's a cultural norm that doesn't happen with non-Chinese employers. Such efforts on the part of Chinese employers fostered a sense of loyalty from employees, where some workers expressed feeling particularly protective towards their Chinese employers and businesses, acknowledging their employers' specific vulnerabilities and linguistic disadvantages as Chinese merchants. Observing and highlighting such mundane and organized practices of interethnic mutual care, collaboration, and conviviality is not to deny that these relationships that take often the form of weak social ties involve unequal power dynamics or tension and conflict specific to individuals and groups, especially in this labor relation. It's only to show that the significant presence of Chinese persons and businesses have influenced the everyday ways that Chileans and migrant residents, shopkeepers, clients, workers have also adapted to this new social and economic configuration in terms of learning new ways to communicate with body language, with gestures, if they don't speak each other's language, and also with generic Spanish rather than the Chilean slang, so that Chinese employers can better understand their workers, right, or neighbors as well. And learning other ways of being with in micro spaces of the neighborhood, sidewalks, street corners, mall corridors, and shop fronts. Viewing social relations from the perspective of lived everyday multiculturalism and interethnic conviviality offers insights, I believe, to how increasing Chinese migration is slowly but surely changing social dynamics in Chile, as more Chinese shops are being established throughout the country, even in small rural towns. And so I will end with talking about these small rural towns and shops, right? Returning to the example of this xenophobic flyer in the beginning about, get out of Villa Alemana, residents of the small town of Villa Alemana defended local Chinese business owners. Chilean residents in the area denounced the flyers rather than participate in discourses and acts of anti-Chinese racism that was very prevalent on social media and the news. These local responses were arguably due to their regular interaction with Chinese shopkeepers in their business spaces, which would humanize them as fellow residents and neighbors for many, as compared to 10 years ago when such a town would not evidence Chinese presence at all, or the Chinese would be associated with one small takeaway restaurant and one family that lives there. And so such new Chinese malls have been opening across the country regularly in the past few years, typically located in rural and small towns or neighborhoods where bigger commercial Chilean-owned shopping complexes such as Falabella, Paris, right, are absent or distant. They would have to travel to get there. These Chinese shops, often run by young Chinese migrants, are often full of a wide variety of products and offer unbeatable prices that threaten other local businesses, So in parentheses, something to talk about. But they're open every day of the week. In a country where most shops are closed on Sundays, these Chinese malls have arguably not only become a part of some locals' weekend leisure routine, where it's a place that can go and window shop, but have also become central spaces of consumption and entertainment in smaller towns with a very limited variety of shops. As more of the Chilean and other migrant population in the country have more opportunities to interact with Chinese shopkeepers, workers, teachers, and professionals, among others, the tension between the opportunities and threats that the Chinese represent in terms of their businesses and cultural diversity will likely endure. I'm not saying that this is all wonderful and positive, right? It will likely endure as a threat to local businesses and opportunities of consumption and accessibility to some goods for other people. Just as representations and discourses about China and the Chinese will continue to reflect broader negotiations of China and Chile political and economic relations and national and ethnic or racialized identities that these imply. So I look forward to the other talks and any of your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Carol. There are already a group of questions. Please take a look at the chat. Again, we will continue with the presentation and with the discussant, and at the end we will have a round of responses by you, but also by Patricia Palma and by Freddy Gonzalez. No? So we continue with the second presentation by Dr. Patricia Palma. Patricia Palma is an assistant professor at the Universidad Tarapacá in Arica in Chile. She has received her PhD from the University of California, Davis in 2017, and she has been working and researching on global health and migration and the influence of Chinese medicine in Latin America, and particularly with a group of publications on Peru. Thank you very much, Patricia. No, we cannot hear you. No. Yes, there was a small sound.
Excuse me 1 second.
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you.
I will share my screen. Where is my? Okay.
Perfect.
I'm very sorry for the problem.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to participate in this event. And also I would like to thank Enrique and Joseph Alter and James Cook for this kind invitation to reflect on the legacy of Chinese immigration on the everyday life in Latin America. Today, I will talk on how Chinese family restaurants in Peru become a crucial tool for social integration into local communities by allowing economic autonomy and better opportunities to immigrants who arrived in the 19th century and their families over the following decades. Chinese immigration has been a major historical force that has shaped modern Peruvian history. As the largest foreign community in the country that existed before the Venezuelans' recent arrival in the last few years, Chinese immigrants maintained their tradition while adopted others in the new soil. In doing so, they introduced new habits and customs that become part of the Peruvian identity. Today, Chinese restaurants, also known as chifas, are considered an essential part of the Peruvian restaurant market and cuisine. Not surprisingly, one of the 3 Peruvians eat a chifa on daily or weekly basis. My research main objective is to examine Chinese immigrant historical legacy in the food market, especially through a small and family-run restaurant, to understand how this establishment transformed the lives of this ethnic community, Peruvians, and their food habits. The study of Chinese food legacy in this Indian country requires understanding the origins and relevance of the immigration in Peru. The arrival of Chinese workers started in 1849, and in 25 years, it already exceeded the 100,000 contract laborers. In the new decades, the number did continue growing until 1909, when the Peruvian government approved a law to control Chinese immigrant arrival to the country. Most of them worked in sugar plantation and guano fields, whereas small groups worked as domestic servants to wealthy families in Lima, the capital city. After completing their 8-year contract, some moved to the city and engaged in informal work selling hot water or food outside of markets. Some of them opened a small and modest restaurant owned as fondas chinas. The fondas threatened many local patrons because the dishes sold there were inexpensive and cooks had adapted the food to the local taste. Opening a restaurant became a popular alternative to economic independence. They did not need sizable financial capital as other business, such as exportation or grocery stores. Fondas required just a few tables and a minimum staff. Affordable price and adaptation allowed Chinese fondas to displace other restaurants in the expansive food market and became the main alternative to workers and poor people who did not cook at home or could not afford expensive meals. With the increase of the anti-Chinese prejudice in the first decade of the 20th century, Chinese fondas and food became a target of racism. The press criticized this restaurant because of the lack of cleanliness and quality of their dishes. Public officials inspected this establishment more than regularly than other facilities. Also, local customers associated Chinese food with dubious quality. Rumors that the meat cooked in Chinese fondas came not from the beef, but from rats, dogs, or even human bodies, circulated in Lima since 1870s due to constant adverse publicity in the local press. Aimed racism, many Chinese fondas owners transformed their restaurant and opened new and more sophisticated facilities known as chifa since 1920s. In 1921, the first Chinese restaurant in Lima that used the category chifa was the Huang Tong, located in Capone Street, Chinatown. However, it was not until 1930s that Chinese restaurant increases in Chinatown. This new restaurant sought to break with the image of fondas and introducing themselves as modern and prosperous establishments. However, in the first decade, there were no significant differences. Since the 1940s, the name chifa became widespread and is the name of both Peruvian Chinese food and the establishment that sell it. As the journalist Mariela Balbi has explained, the term chifa comes from the Cantonese and the Hakka words "sik fan," meaning eat rice. Peruvians who frequented Chinatown probably heard the phrase and repeated the word to describe the restaurant. One of the most important, chifa, was the Sanjay Law, places in Chinatown. Like many other international restaurant owners, Mr. Chong too paid for advertising in the city's major newspaper and magazines, especially in Oriental, a bilingual Spanish-Chinese magazine, which published his first issues in 1931 and continue until today. Over the years, it is possible to observe a transformation in how these restaurants presented themselves to the public. The ads described themselves as modern, elegant, and similar to other international restaurants. With this new business method, chifas aimed to reach a new clientele, one very different from who frequented Chinese fondas. Thus, Chinese became places for family reunions and celebration of significant events within the Chinese community, but also Peruvians in general. In the next decade, the number of chifa grew in Lima and in the country, and more Chinese families decide to invest in this kind of business. Culinary stories. If something characterized chifas in Peru is their geographic ubiquity. You can find them throughout the country and the capital in all the districts, from the wealthy to the poorest. Most of their owners only have one establishment with a few tables, while a small group are part of large chains, such as Madame Toussaint, from the renowned chef Gaston Acurio. But chifas are more than their tasty dishes. Behind each of these restaurants, there is a history of a family, the transfer of culinary traditions, and a business that have known how to adapt and reinvent itself. In my chapter, I analyze the trajectory of 3 families who opened a chifa in Lima, but today, for the limited time, I'm going to present only one, the Tong family. In 2016, Sanjin Wu Tong and 10 cousins opened the chifa Wu Tong in Santiago de Surco, an affluent district with significant economic growth in the recent years. By the end of the first year, this restaurant not only survived, but the business registered a turnover about $1 million soles, around $300,000. And the partners are preparing to open a second location. Sanjin Wu Tong, one of the owners of this chifa, attributes its success on using a combination of tradition and modernity. The Tong cousins have benefited from the parents' experience and their grandparents' family restaurant, the Chung Yong. The chifa Chung Yong, located in Barranco, Bohemian tourist district in Peru, in Lima, is today one of the oldest in the country. Despite the political and economic up and downs that Peru has experienced in the last century, the restaurant have continued operating. The history of Chung Yong goes back to the 1920s, when the first chifas opened in the country's capital. Its founder, Mr. Tong Hu, who once in Peru would change his name to Juan Tong, believed he was traveling to the United States. However, like many other immigrants, his journey ended in Peru because of anti-immigration law in the United States in this moment. Unlike many other Chinese immigrants who traveled to Peru in the first decade of the 20th century, Mr. Tong had no family. However, did not stop him to opening a business of his own and becoming independent. Law associated with a paisano to open his first restaurant and used Lima merchant community to access culinary inputs. After a couple of years, Mr. Tong's business partner returned to China, transferring his part of the business. Eventually, Mr. Tong would marry with Felicita Luna de Tong of Peruvian origin and form a large family of 9 children. Most of them worked in the family restaurant and continue to do so. All the Tong clan will learn the family business philosophy: sell good products, sell a lot, and it doesn't matter if you earn less. To him, good seasoning was only one of the ingredients from the successful culinary business. Chifa were a quite profitable and gave parents the economic means to help their children become professional. Previous to opening the Chungtong, many of the owners were publicists, accountants, and engineers. This professional job enabled them to have a modern vision of this restaurant. In the fact, the head chef, Chanxin Putong, followed his passion for cooking after finishing his engineering studies. They received help and support from their parents, who, despite not being the owners, are attentive to maintaining the food integrity and adhering to the family business philosophy. And today, Chanxin is one of the most famous Chinese chefs in Lima. Conclusions and proposals. Chinese restaurants in Peru have been essential to Chinese diaspora and interethnic relations. They have transformed Peruvian gastronomy and have become a favorite for locals and part of what is recognized as Chinese cuisine abroad. Since the beginning in the 19th century, this establishment has allowed the Chinese community to generate important links with the local population. They have become meeting place, and despite anti-Chinese rhetoric, have had a crucial role in feeding the local working class. As we have seen, for thousands of Chinese immigrants, the opening a fonda or later a chifa has improved their lives. Many chifas were family businesses where Chinese family members and immigrants spent many hours working in and out of the kitchen. For the owners, the sacrifice allowed economic independence and prosperity. Many second and third generation Chinese Peruvians are now professionals. And for many, for working at Chifa, it was a springboard that allowed them to gain experience and open their own restaurant. Since the first Chinese restaurant opened in Lima in the 1870s, this business has changed. At first, Peruvian and Chinese working were the main clientele of Chinese fondas. The press, a local authority, strongly criticized this masculinized space, both regarding sanitary condition and food quality. In the 1930s, fondas became chifas, and they are not today. But what is the future of family chifa in Peru? Although the food industry has diversified with new restaurants offering varied international cuisine type, Chinese restaurants continue to grow in Lima and around the world. As the anthropologist Humberto Rodriguez Pastor points out, despite the lack of precise data, present Chinese immigrants with economic capital continue to open small chifa, especially in populous neighborhoods. By 2003, Lima had 4,000 chifa that employ 32,000 people. A report published in 2008 by David Reyes and Miguel Bellido indicated that in Lima, every day, 2 new Chinese restaurants open daily. Currently, Chinese restaurants rank third in the restaurant industry in Peru, with the highest turnover in the country. According to the consulting firm Flanqueo, in 2018, 35% of the population consume Chinese food daily or weekly, while 25% eat it every 15 days and 40% monthly. In terms of risk and investment, managing a chifa has proved to be safe business with a little chance of closing during the first year compared to other restaurants. Only 10% of chifa close in the first year, while the percentage rises to 40% in the general restaurant market. Thus, everything indicates they will be expanding the following years. Today, the industry is undergoing many changes, where tradition and innovation sometimes collide. Many parents who own chifa strive to keep the food authenticities, while their children are more open to fusion and to use technology. The daily operation of this restaurant are also changing. Venezuela migration has transformed the service sector, and chifa has not been oblivious of this phenomenon. Currently, many of these restaurants have waiters from Venezuela. Chifas have stopped being exclusively Chinese space with Peruvian and immigrant wait staff. However, they are still very reluctant to hand over the kitchen to non-Chinese people. While the data projects that this gastronomic sector will be continued to grow in the coming years, we also hope the studies of them will do so as well. Much remains to know about how these restaurants operate outside of Lima, how they have changed, and mostly how this place has influenced Peruvians' daily lives over the last 150 years. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Patricia, for your very interesting contribution and research such as Carlos. No? Well, we have now the luxury to have Professor Freddy Gonzalez as a discussant. Thank you very much, Freddy. I know, and we know very well that you have been working on these topics for a long time, and you could give us easily a presentation by yourself on the topics you are working. No? So again, I'm very thankful for your time and for your reflections as a discussant. I remind you, Dr. Freddy Gonzalez is today an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he was formerly a professor at the University of Colorado during the period 2013-2019. He holds a PhD from Yale University and counts with a group of documents and publications in peer-reviewed articles on Chinese immigration, mainly in Mexico from a historical, social, and territorial perspective. And his most recent book is on Paisanos Chinos, Trans-Pacific Politics among Chinese immigrants in Mexico from UC Press. Thank you very much, Freddy.
Thank you, Enrique, for that kind introduction. And I'll have pretty brief remarks to save plenty of time for Q&A, but want to appreciate this opportunity to read these really wonderful papers, and to Ariel for his really fantastic and comprehensive keynote this morning. So these three papers, I think, grapple with very similar questions. And I'll talk a little bit about Sergio Martinez's paper as well, by the way. Similar questions of Chineseness, of community and identity in a globalized and neoliberal Latin America. And with the arrival of new waves of Chinese migration to Latin America, or Xin Yimin after 1978. And with a region that I think is grappling with multiculturalism and what that might mean for its very visible immigrants. As the organizers of the conference recognize, these papers highlight, as Enrique mentioned, the importance of Chinese migration to China's diplomatic, political, and economic relations with the region and vice versa, right? So diplomatic and political relations also really impact migration to the region. These papers bridge historical approaches on like earlier waves of migration to Latin America with newer ones, and kind of bridge historical approaches with sociological and anthropological approaches to see connections between the past and present. Patricia Palma's paper grapples with the question of chifas in Peru, old and new. Her paper showcases the resilience of chifas in Latin America as an immigrant enterprise, allowing for economic autonomy despite longtime suspicions about their quality and health. In the present, as Palma notes, the Chinese have made an indelible contribution to Peruvian national cuisine. Particularly fascinating for me was how trends in China-Latin America trade affected the viability of Chinese restaurants by affecting, for example, the ingredients that they could procure or their kind of perceived authenticity. Her discussion, as she notes, forms part of a burgeoning literature on Chinese foodways in the Americas, part of a larger edited volume on Chinese restaurants in the United States and beyond. And it reminds me as well about the discussion about the transformation and recent chicness of quote unquote Nikkei cuisine in Peru. I listened recently to an interview of Chef Tsumura of a restaurant called Maido in Lima. And he mentioned how Nikkei cuisine has evolved in multiple ways, right? In response to newer waves of economic integration, but also newer waves of migrants. In other words, that cuisine, we can't really look at cuisine as like a monolithic or a static way, but that it evolves along with the chronology and migratory waves of people arriving to the region. It's interesting to me as well that along with new modernizing cuisine, there was an appetite for old dishes that was perceived that chifas used to serve traditionally. Finally, I'm interested in chifas as social spaces in addition to just being restaurants, right? So this kind of parallels Laxio's work on Chino-Latino restaurants in New York and how they're kind of social spaces for Chino-Latinos in New York. And so I was wondering about whether and how these restaurants serve as social spaces for local Chinese in the region. Carol Chan's really fascinating paper tracks the discussion on whether to label this multicultural neighborhood known as Migs into a Chinatown. And it's kind of the latest phase in a long history of a relatively small Chinese presence in the region, as well as a new relationship between the People's Republic of China and various countries in Latin America. Although the Chinese population in Chile was historically small, it's been growing very quickly in past decades, which has increased their visibility in the discussion around their presence. And as she notes, it reminds me of the discussion of the creation of Chinatowns in other spaces. Monica de Hart has written on Costa Rica, the Chinatown in Cuba, right, which has been not very charitably characterized as like a Chinatown without Chinese people. And showcases the importance of Chinese symbolically to demonstrating a long time and friendly relationship between China and Latin America, right? When Chinese dignitaries visit Mexico, for example, they often visit Acapulco, despite the fact that Acapulco doesn't really have many Chinese people. And then Sergio Martinez, who unfortunately wasn't able to make it, chronicles the development of a new Chinese neighborhood, Viaducto Piedad, in the wake of new Chinese migration to the region and in light of increased trade flows between China and Mexico. And he notes that Viaducto is a much more vigorous space for community among more recent migrants to Mexico, in contrast to older neighborhoods like Dolores, which now largely house restaurants and are spaces for major holidays like Mid-Autumn Festival, Zhongqiujie, or Chinese New Year, or Chunjie. So this follows the pattern of other Chinatowns in Latin America and elsewhere, where descendants are much less likely to live in the Chinese neighborhood that their earlier generations might have arrived and settled in. I'm thinking specifically about like Mexicali, for example, and to seek more comfortable housing and greater opportunities elsewhere. So all three papers, they bring up the longtime presence of Chinese in the region, but also note how newer waves of migration both build upon and diverge significantly from earlier waves. Older waves arrived primarily as laborers and only with difficulty acquired the capital to set up restaurants. It was, for example, ex-coolies that founded the chifas in Peru. They also founded abarrotes and laundries that newer migrants created from the rural. Newer migrants are no longer strict men or largely men, but also increasingly include women and families. And as Jimena Alba noted, they enjoy a greater facility to participate in transnational capital flows. And they also include a greater amount of people with education and professionals. Newer waves come from different regions of China, as Carol Chan noted, speak different dialects of Chinese, settle in new regions, and in many cases build their careers more readily on the intensive recent businesses and cultural ties between China and Latin America. So all of these papers talk about the relationship and or lack thereof between older waves of migrants or descendants and newer waves. So Chan notes that in contrast to earlier waves, which are assumed to have concentrated in individual neighborhoods, MIGS was a multicultural neighborhood where people of different nationalities developed networks of mutual trust, which perhaps dampened local racism against them. And it's interesting that this kind of cuts against the actions of perhaps earlier waves to the region. And it's especially interesting to me that Sergio Martinez suggested that newer migrants did not feel the need to join Chinese associations, which I think has impacts for all three papers, which in the past had been a defensive tactic against the large wave of xenophobia that rocked Latin America during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, right? So like one thing that I argue in my book is that Chinese joined associations in part due to the anti-Chinese movement in Mexico. So this might also mean, unfortunately, that we might miss some of those who are not active as presently in the Chinese community, precisely just because they're not as visible for us. It's interesting that all three papers mention COVID, perhaps inevitable. And this brings up the question of how the Latin American communities will be transformed by the pandemic. As Rachel Lim notes, for example, she's a scholar at Berkeley in ethnic studies, racism against Latin American migrants has increased in the age of COVID, more resurgence of old worries about the public health risks of the Chinese, as well as anxieties about their presence more generally, and anxieties about China's presence in the region and trade with Latin America. Migrants have reported increasing suspicion and physical attacks around the entire region, which makes me wonder how new neighborhoods like Viaducto Piedad or the new Chinatowns are being founded will fare moving forward. Will new migrants end up having to return to China due to the closure of their businesses, or will they try to settle and try their luck elsewhere? As Palma has noted, will economic necessity mean that Peruvian chifas continue to rely on a diversified workforce, including Venezuelans, moving perhaps or departing from an all-Chinese workforce? All three papers are national in scope. And so this brings up the question of transnational connections between Chinese migrants to the region. Many of the kind of trade relationships between China and Latin America are also like international or interregional. Chinese historically maintained transnational connections, not only between China and Latin America, but also within Latin America and with the United States. Mexican Chinese, for example, participated in transnational smuggling of migrants to the US, and Chinese capital from the US helped the transformation of Chinese businesses and Chinatowns in Cuba and Mexico, to give a couple of examples. So these papers are really great, and they bring, I think, new and very overdue recognition to the importance of the Chinese in Latin America. And just as a kind of last set of questions, I'm wondering, you know, if part of our purpose is to give increased visibility to the Chinese in the region, on what terms? Right? So how do we avoid essentializing perceptions? How do we capture the complexity of communities that defy easy categorization and analysis? Chan's discussion of the foundation of the Chinatown and the lack of awareness on the part of Zhejiang migrants suggests this disconnect between the local, perhaps Zhejiang government, and the migrants themselves. And that, I think, poses certain challenges for scholars, especially those who might focus on like top-down approaches to building to Latin American China relations. As Martinez mentioned, notable in Viaducto Piedad is the role of the Protestant Church, which has served as a nexus for newer Chinese migrants and would have escaped the attention of most of us who have mostly focused on associations sponsored by Chinese embassies and consulates, which are mostly focused on business and social ties. I would note here the presence and activity of groups of second generation Chinese Latin Americans who also kind of escape our attention sometimes, especially Tusanake. Tusanake is incredibly vigorous, a very powerful, probably the largest group of Chinese Latin Americans in the entire region. And they investigate not only Chinese Peruvian, but also have symposia on Chinese in other parts of the region and on Chinese in Iberia. And they try to investigate the history on its own terms. They invite scholars on their own terms, and they have their own online archive, where they stockpile primary and secondary sources. And similar groups like Mónica Cinco's Inmigraciones Chinas a México do similar things, right? Try on their own to kind of build their own histories. And then finally, following the cue of Teresa Ko, who works on Koreans in Argentina, given the larger numbers of Japanese and Koreans in the region, many of whom are nevertheless subject to the baggage of centuries of racist animus against the Chinese, right? I wonder whether a pan-ethnic strategy may come to fruition and how that complicates these papers. So in sum, it's really great that this field, which used to consist of little more than Evelyn Hudahart and Jeffrey Lesser, has now grown so powerfully and with such like fruitful and productive research. And I look forward to seeing the work of all of these scholars develop. They're fantastic because of their nuance, and they also point out just how much research there is left to do on the region. Thank you very much.
Okay, Freddie, thank you very much. I'm as enthusiastic as you are on these three contributions. Patricia and Carol, I think, and I hope you have the possibility of seeing some of the questions. Many questions, in addition to Freddie's comments, suggestions, etc. So I would suggest to make a first, maybe a second round of responses by Carol, Patricia, and even if of Freddie. There are some questions by Freddie. I would also include by myself, since if you might be lacking questions. I would like to ask you, Patricia, Carol, and even Freddie, maybe, regarding what is the role of the Chinese embassies in the more recent Chinese immigration. No, I think the case of Carol, or the analysis of Carol, trying to distinguish between old traditional Guangdong versus Zhejiang immigration. What is the role of the embassy there, even in Chifas, maybe in Peru? Does the embassy, the Chinese embassy, play any role at all? And even in the newer immigration, in the Mexican case, I'm not positive. In the more traditional immigration, it was clear. In the more recent one, I'm not positive. And the second, more general academic question, maybe, if there is a discussion regarding Latin American and Caribbean comparative studies on this more recent Chinese immigration, no? As we have heard today, but also by Mónica Cinco, Da Costa Dantas, and many other more recent Chinese immigration. There are lots of very interesting results coming up in Chile, in Brazil, in Central America, and Mexico. Is there an institution where these topics are being discussed? I'm asking because, again, I'm very ignorant on this very particular topic. No, so maybe we can start with Carol, we continue with Patricia and with Freddie, and if possible, we might do a second round. No, Carol, please.
Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you so much for the very enthusiastic and very thorough, very insightful comment by Freddie. It's a great honor because we know the contribution of your book and your research to this field, right? So many things, but I wanted to first address the pan-ethnic question. I think it's a very intriguing, one of the most fascinating questions to be asked, right? Of which I don't think there's any answer, but Teresa Ko's proposal is something to think about. But on a very practical level, I find that it is very, very hard because of, even if we talk about the Chinese community, there is so much segregation. So it's even more difficult to think about them or some primary actors conversing with the Japanese and the Koreans, and they have just such different experiences and identities. So it's hard, but as a scholar, as an activist, it is an intriguing kind of idyllic, utopic idea, right, to aspire to. And I think it's something worth thinking about, considering always. What else respond to. I think something that comes up in many of these discussions about old Chinese and new Chinese migrants, what comes across to me is this sense of why are the Chinese constantly seen as foreign, right? Even in the US, right? Even, I mean, there's always this, sometimes they're Asian American, sometimes they're just Asian. And I think it's the constantly renewed migration, right? That keeps this constant perception that the Chinese are new migrants. So even if they've been there for generations, third generations, when you see a Chinese person on the street, they are associated with new migrants. So they're constantly new migrants and constantly remaining foreign in a certain way, regardless of all the nuances we try to say, regardless of the chifas. I think maybe in Peru it might be different. So I think maybe Patricia can speak to that, but at least in Chile. And so I'll just respond to all the questions I can remember. The role of the Chinese embassy and the need for Chinese associations in Chile. I didn't focus on this too much, but from what I know, I think the embassy mainly, well, firstly does administrative work, but also speaks mainly to Chinese businesses or people who are more elite, who have more capital, right? And so there's networking in that sense. But I would say that the regular new Cantonese migrant opening a Chinese restaurant would have very little communication with the embassy in terms of help or any kind of event. There would be kind of a distance. And for Chinese associations as well, it speaks more to businesses and more bigger. For example, if someone is opening a mall, I would feel that person and group would have communication with the embassy and with Chinese associations, but not really smaller merchants with little capital. COVID in Chile and how it has affected, how has the pandemic affected perceptions of China and Chinese people? I would say for now that there is more suspicion towards China in general, right? There is even recently, there's a news in Chile where all the funcionarios, all the healthcare workers in the south in a hospital rejected the Sinovac. They didn't want to take the vaccine. So that is a very strong indicator of the suspicion, right? And so then the Chilean authorities had to come out to kind of apologize. Oh, it was a mistake. We didn't give you enough information. So it seems like you can see the imbalance, right? With maybe a lack of suspicion, a lesser suspicion for Pfizer and what it means, and Sinovac, and this whole idea about China. But I would say suspicion towards Chinese people in terms of being associated with the disease and pandemic has definitely gone away, just because it's everywhere and it's so widespread. And I'm not sure how it impacts other places, but at least in Chile, Chinese people are no longer really associated with having COVID because anyone can have COVID. And also because the stigma was very soon replaced by other migrants. So migrants from Haiti who lived in overcrowded conditions. So it was associated with different population. So I would say it produces anti-China suspicions towards China, but not really towards Chinese people, even though that there is definitely a connection there, right? I will stop here and let Patricia respond, and then later maybe come back to the other questions.
Thank you, Carol. Patricia.
Yes, I want to be very clear in some answers, so I'm very sorry, but sometime I will change to Spanish because I feel more comfortable to answering some of the questions in Spanish. But I will start with James Cook, try to answer in English. If chifa cuisine similar to American food, I can say yes, because I'm trying to relate with something that Freddie mentioned in his presentation about transnational relationship. Is this possible to observe in the first decade of the 20th century, the relevance to California and Lima trade in order to get the food products? And especially in the Oriental magazine and in the ad, we can see how the chifa owners try to, I don't know the word is copy, but have a strong influence by the owners of Chinese restaurants in California. So they use similar words to present the restaurant and also say the chaufa, who is the most popular dish, Chinese food dish in Peru, was similar to chow mein, to say we are the same. So I think there are a strong influence to Chinese food in California, in Lima. And about the other questions, so give me one second. Entonces, voy a responder en español, te pido disculpas. Sobre tu sanaje, creo que es sumamente importante la red de esta segunda y tercera generación que menciona Freddy, y para mí, en mi estudio sobre los chifas, creo que no es posible entender la importancia hoy de estos restaurantes si no entendemos a la segunda y la tercera generación que los continuó, que logró que se expandieran y que hoy en día tienen importantes conflictos con sus abuelos o con sus padres por el tema de la tradición. Las entrevistas que pude realizar me mencionaban esto, que ellos, estos primos que abren un restaurante, deciden alejarse del núcleo familiar porque tienen muchas ideas y no pueden desarrollarlas. Entonces hay acá hay un problema entre tradición y modernidad. Sobre el tema de las embajadas, una de las cosas que es interesante es cómo hoy en día muchas de las reuniones políticas y sociales se realizan en los chifas. Los chifas continúan siendo un lugar que congrega a la comunidad. Sin embargo, y uno de los puntos que yo pude observar en mi investigación es que mientras la comunidad china se presentó como próspera, los prósperos comerciantes no correspondían a los dueños de chifa. Ellos están siempre como están relegados en un tercero o cuarto lugar. Son lugares comerciales muy, muy pequeños. Eso. Lamento el cambio de idioma, pero de verdad me interesaba que quedara como muy claro lo que me preguntó Freddy y el resto de las personas.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Freddy, I think there are, in addition to your general additional reflections, there are a couple of questions regarding comparative studies of Chinatowns in LAC, regarding also comparative to the United States, the question of Ariel Armani regarding Chino Latinx spaces in the US, and academic spaces of these more recent debates and discussions on immigration in the last years. Are there academic spaces for comparing these discussions, such as the work of Patricia, Carol, Sergio, and others, among other questions? No?
Yeah, I thought that was a really important question that you asked. And as to all the other questions, if Carol or Patricia have any supplementary knowledge, like please jump in and let us know. As far as the kind of institutional space, I think it has always been a little bit in the process of formation. And you know, you kind of run with us in similar spaces in LASA and in AAS, where I think, you know, we occupy similar spaces and kind of talk. There are spaces for us to kind of unite. Beyond that, I think there's ISCO, which is the International Society for the Scholars of Chinese Overseas, which I think has provided a really important space. And that's a kind of global diasporic organization, but I think there are lots of scholars who focus on Latin America. And occasionally ISCO has been it's been in Cuba. I went to the one in Panama, which was really fascinating. And a quick side note for Patricia, at ISCO, Panama, the local, first of all, Panama City has 4 Chinatowns, which is fascinating. And 2 is that local Chinese restaurateurs offered us all of our meals. We went to literally every break was at a different restaurant owned by a Chinese, but they were all teppanyaki places. And the reason was that they could charge more for them. So the expectation was that they would charge very little for Chinese food, but if they serve Japanese food, then they can charge a lot more. And that was a better business strategy. And then one last thing is, I don't know if you're familiar with Ricardo Martinez Esquivel in Costa Rica, University of Costa Rica, right? But that I think is a really important, his red, I'm blanking on the name of his organization, but it's for like China studies in Latin America centered in Costa Rica, and a really important facet of that is study of Chinese migration. But you know, this field can be so US centric and so North America centric that it's really important to have, for example, Enrique's Sechi Mix, which I attended when I lived in Mexico, and to have like Latin American centers, right, where that attracts North American scholars to come in and have a forum for exchange, to have like English spoken as well as Spanish and Portuguese, and to really kind of share our knowledge with each other. Because I think the language barrier sometimes is really difficult to overcome sometimes. Really quickly on restaurants, it's not something that I do research on myself. I'm really looking forward to Locke's book, which I think is coming hopefully this year. But one thing that I have understood through kind of my reading on this topic, I'm interested in how migrants to Latin America end up kind of migrating to the US and what that means for their identity and for their racialization. And even if you think of like Afro-Latin Americans, their identity can shift in really perceptible ways when they arrive in the United States, right? It's a fascinating book called Race on the Move about Afro-Brazilians who are then racialized very differently. And for Asian Latinos or people who become Asian Latinos in the US, they often express this difficulty with often having to explain themselves or having no way to kind of embrace the totalness of their identity, right? Like running in different circles, being confident with multiple languages. And so that like Locke found that Chino Latino restaurants in New York City are these one spaces where they don't have to explain themselves to anybody. And like people who are there understand the totality of their identity, which I found really fascinating, right? And if they go to like a Cuban restaurant, then they have to say like, well, like my parents are from Cuba, or like, you know, they always have to explain the partialness of their identity otherwise. So looking forward to Locke's work on that. And I think we do need more on like secondary migration to the US and on like serial migration. We have a fair amount on like return migration to China and Japan, but I think we need to understand more of like how these migrants move to North America.
Thank you very much, Freddy. So I would suggest briefly in terms of the time, if Carol, Patricia, Freddy wishes to respond to some of the additional questions. Again, there is a big list of questions. Do you wish to mention something in addition before we end the session, Carol?
Yeah, I think I should respond to some of the questions, which I haven't. Someone asked a question about Zhejiang migration, if the contemporary ones, they see themselves as sojourners or permanent residents. I think, and in the book chapter in the paper, I talk about this too. The fact that they feel that they identify as sojourners, that's very important, and that distinguishes themselves from the Cantonese. Even the new Cantonese migrants, they come here and they project their future to stay here in Chile. But the Zhejiangese migrants have this idea that we're going to be here because it's a new market, it's not saturated yet, we're going to earn everything, you know, do our business. And when the market's saturated, when we're not getting enough profits, it's too many people, we're going to move to the next place. And in fact, a lot of them moved from a third country. So for example, they moved from Eastern Europe, or they moved from Dubai, where, you know, there was not enough opportunities, and then they moved to Chile. So it was very common if I spoke to someone, they would say, oh, I came from Germany. So they didn't come from China per se. And so there's this idea that when they're done, when Chile's economy is not as good or whatever it is, they'll move to the next country. So I would say they and someone wrote really eloquently about this, I think is Neri. He said that the Chinese, especially the new Chinese, right, migrants, many of them can see themselves as a global majority versus how the Cantonese migrants who may see themselves as an ethnic minority within their country of destination. And that still resonates, I think, in what I found in my research. And that also goes along with, I think, Dr. Alter asked this question about social media. Someone asked a question about social media. But I think that also contributes to this idea of a global majority, because they do have their WeChat, Weixin, and news, and this idea, and this is a space that creates this idea of overseas Chinese, where they're constantly connected to it. That wasn't available before. And very quickly, as far as I know, Beijing is not playing a role in the funding of this Chinatown in Santiago, but only the small local government and Chinese persons in Chile. And I can't speak very much to Confucius Institutes, but what I can say is that there are strategic alliances between the China Media Group and Chilean mainstream media. So they have collaborations, and they have bought kind of spaces in La Tercera, which is a very big newspaper, news media company in Chile, and Cooperativa. So they sponsor or commission articles or videos, reports about China specifically. So that is a space that hopes to contribute to more information about China and in the realm of cultural diplomacy, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Carol. Patricia, would you like to say something before we?
Yes, about the COVID, and similar like Carol mentioned before. I think that the relevance of Chinese business today in Peru has changed how the press present the Chinese community and China itself. And also, and unlike the image that I show in my presentation, today the government has tried to, I don't know if control, but to respond the anti-Chinese comment in the press. For today, Peru will be the first country in the Americas to get access to the Chinese vaccine, for instance. And the government have tried to respond some sector that criticize or put in doubt the vaccine. So I think today the media is more positive to the Chinese community, especially for the strong way that Chinese economy have improved.
Great, thank you very much, Patricia. Freddy, would you like to comment something in addition?
No, but this was a really fantastic discussion and great papers. I'm happy to see so much interest on Latin America, China.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, everybody. We are very happy to see new blood, new discussions, new generations. And well, as it happens, we don't finish the discussions, but we just start. So from my side, and before I give the microphone to Joe, I would simply like to thank you very much to everybody, particularly to the participants and audiences. I'm very surprised by a good group of participants, which means there is interest on these topics, no? And I'm very thankful to the Center for Latin American Studies of the University of Pittsburgh for their support, but mainly also to the Asian Studies Center and to all the group of technical support yesterday by Rachel Jacobson, today by another group of the technical supporters. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim and Joe. An honor to have the support of Ariel Armani, and well, we are looking forward to continue participating with the Red Académica América Latina y el Caribe sobre China. No, thank you very much to everybody. Joe, I don't know if you would like to say something to finalize.
Thank you, Enrique. Just a few words in closing, primarily of thanks to the presenters, both yesterday as well as today. Really a fascinating collection of papers that take us from infrastructure to everyday life, to representations of ethnicity that transect sort of material forms of identity, and all sorts of interesting aspects that extend out from there into things that are much more ineffable. I thought all aspects of the presentation were really wonderful, and the encompassing keynote addresses by Jose Manuel yesterday and by Ariel Armani today really provided a wonderful analytical umbrella as well as a contextualization. So greatly appreciated all the way around. Just as a final word of thanks to Enrique, our collaboration with him is growing stronger, and we are delighted that the connection that we have to Latin America through the colleagues who have participated in this conference represents our growing interest in global Asia and global identity as linked to Asia in various ways. I'm reminded in particular about the way in which, through my conversations with the Association of Asian Studies, the interest in global Asia is becoming all the more important to area studies in Asian studies. I was in communication with Tina Chen and the journal Verge, which exploring new ways to analyze global Asias. And this is demonstrating both the interdisciplinarity of area studies and the way in which identity is no longer anchored in geographical space. So really stimulating, really exciting discussions. And so I wanted to thank all of the participants, our keynote addresser, the discussants and the panelists, and finally, our participants. We really appreciate your attendance in the conference from all over the world. And as you can see from the slide that has been put on the screen, we have a number of upcoming events which may be of interest to many of you. The talk coming up on economic dependency and public opinion. Dr. Julia Strauss will be speaking on February 16th. Then March 25th and 27th on a Thursday and Saturday, the Latin American Social and Public Policy Conference, and Deals and Disputes, China, Hong Kong, and Commercial Law in May. So we look forward to your involvement in all of these events and programs, and are really excited about how this fits into our perspective on global Asia. So thank you very much. I look forward to seeing the presenters when we will reconvene at 11:45 to talk about future plans in concrete terms to take the conversation forward. So thank you again, and much appreciated.